I'm with the Utah Association of Counties, and as an organization, we were selected by the governor's office in partnership with Sorensen Impact at the University of Utah to manage the state of Utah's Opportunity Zone planning and implementation. And I think just before we jump into the presentation, one of the unique things that GoEd did was they really focused our efforts off the Wasatch Front. We still work in the Wasatch Front, obviously. The majority of our zones in the state are within the Wasatch Front, but I think in a really innovative move by the governor's office, they saw the need to kind of truly align with the Opportunity Zone incentive and go to the communities that are really designed to try and get some of this private capital, which is, the rest of the state and some of our rural communities. So it's been a good year working in that role, and I'm pleased to be here today to both give you an update on Opportunity Zones as well as the work that we're doing across the state. So before we start, and there we go. Just a quick primer, and this may be redundant for some of you, but the Opportunity Zone legislation goes back to the 2018 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And part of the rationale and really the momentum that created the Opportunity Zone program was a group called the Economic Innovation Group based in Washington, D.C., looking at what they called economic dynamism or prosperity, and realizing that the amount of distressed communities post 2008 Great Recession not only were growing at a slower rate than some of their urban counterparts and larger cities, but in some cases they were declining. And if you look at the Distressed Communities Index here, it's clear that there's many areas across the country that were really struggling to grow economically. And one of the things that EIG heard consistently was that there was really a lack of private investment capital to go into these communities. And so what they did with the Opportunity Zones was they allowed governors of every single state and territory in the US to select up to 25% of their low income census tracts. So the boundaries that you see on the map are census tracts that could be designated as these newly formed Opportunity Zones. So in Utah, we had 181 eligible areas. That meant Governor Herbert could select up to 46. And as you can see on the list, they're distributed throughout the state. They're in 18 counties. You can see on the map that some of the more rural zones look quite a bit larger. That's because our census tracts in rural areas are significantly larger than they are in Salt Lake. You can see that Salt Lake County, as an example, has 15 zones, but on the map, you can't quite see how big that really is, but it really kind of represents both ends of the spectrum in that we've got most of downtown Salt Lake City designated as a zone, and if you look on the eastern part of our state, we've got large parts of Carbon County and Grand County designated as zones. So we have a really unique layout within our state. What it provides to investors, just to quickly go through this, is it's really designed to target capital gains dollars. So if you're an investor who's either in the real estate space, if you've got a large portfolio of public equities, anytime you sell an asset, it creates a capital gains tax liability. And by putting that money into a newly formed Opportunity Zone fund that is investing in these communities that we just saw on the last slide, investors get an immediate deferral on that tax liability, so they don't have to pay the tax that they otherwise would have had to pay at the end of the year. That deferral goes through the end of 2026. If they stay within the fund for 5 years, that initial tax liability that they had gets a 10% step up in basis, or what is essentially a 10% discount. If they stay for 7 years, which is now tricky because we're in 2020, so we're less than 7 years to that 2026 date, so they can't really get this on new investments. But if they would have invested last year, they'd get an additional 5% discount. But the real kicker, and what many investors really care about within this, is that any new growth on whatever it is that they invest in one of these communities, if they hold it for 10 years and say that investment doubles in value, that new doubling of value can be pocketed completely tax-free so long as it happens more than 10 years from the date of the initial investment. And so what this has done is really galvanized the private investment sector in a way that has been unprecedented so far. And what we're seeing is it's not just individuals that are looking at doing this, but it's large financial institutions like banks and insurance companies. PNC Bank, as an example, based in Pennsylvania, has launched a $500 million opportunity zone fund using gains off of their own balance sheet. We're seeing some corporations take advantage of this. Obviously, I think the biggest one, and it's abbreviated here as HNWI, which is high net worth individuals. There's a large amount of folks who have extremely large capital gains events happening every year, and they're viewing opportunity zones as a way to not only alleviate the tax burden, but go into community investments that previously, going back to the map that we saw on the first slide, they just didn't really have an incentive to. I think most of the investors that we talked to, they weren't opposed to going into some of these communities. They weren't opposed to community development. But when you're weighing investing in, let's say, the hottest venture fund based in San Francisco with a rural economic development project, that rural economic development project often doesn't win. But now that we have the opportunity zone incentive, we're seeing the decision process really flip back the other way. One of the biggest questions I get and continue to get is, what can we invest in, and what are the kind of eligible investments? And the answer is it's extremely broad. The only things that are really prohibited and called out within the law that you cannot invest in are what they call sin businesses. So no liquor stores, tanning salons, casinos, golf courses are surprisingly included in that. But everything else is really fair game. What we're seeing most investors gravitate towards is real estate investments, mainly because they fit within the regulatory framework much more easily than an operating business could fit. But I think it's important to note that the true intent of this bill, when it was passed at the federal level, was to reinvigorate startup activity, bring operating businesses from major urban cities into smaller kind of suburban and rural communities. It's designed to create jobs. I think so far, because of the trickiness that goes into, having to worry about where a business remains located and how it potentially stays qualified within the regulatory framework, it's made some investors a little bit less palatable to invest in businesses. But we're seeing everything from manufacturing facilities being built, brownfield redevelopment, a lot of affordable housing and workforce housing is being done across the country. And there's really, a ton of applicability in the infrastructure space. So we're aware of several large solar projects, wind projects. We're actually seeing some cities themselves and counties themselves take advantage of this and getting opportunity zone investors to build them new facilities. The city or county agrees to buy back 10 plus years from now. But I think the kind of final bullet I have here on the slide at the bottom of it's important to set expectations is a key piece in this. What opportunity zones don't do is they don't take bad investments and make them good. And they don't create a whole new subset of investors that are magically going to look at projects that previously just didn't pencil altogether. What they do is they take good investments and make them great, or they take investments that previously may have not been prioritized by some of these investment groups listed on the left, and they make it kind of come higher on that priority list because of the additional tax advantages that you get. But one of the things that I think we saw early on in our work were a lot of the communities calling us and saying, hey, we just got an opportunity zone. So, how does this work? Do we fill out a federal application and the investors show up tomorrow? And the answer is there really is no marketplace within this. It's an extremely inefficient marketplace. Anyone with a capital gain could be a potential investor. You're seeing existing real estate development companies raise their own funds utilizing OZ dollars, but that means there still is a lot of work that needs to be done to take the needs of the communities across the state of Utah and align them with investors who are ready to look at projects that are really ready to be shovel ready. So another question I get is, how is it working? We're now just over 2 years in, and Novogradac & Co. is a leading kind of accounting firm that has been tracking the qualified opportunity funds across the country. And what they've seen is pretty promising. We're up to almost $8 billion in OZ equity raised across the country, 308 qualified opportunity funds reporting within that. But the collective community investment capacity of those organizations is just under 70 billion. So when you go back to the kind of unprecedented amount of private capital that's now flowing to these communities, that's the number we're talking about, and we only expect to continue to grow. The amount of projects in Utah is a big one that we're trying to get a number on. We're aware of several large developments on the Wasatch Front. We're actually aware of several large rural projects as well, but Utah has certainly been viewed as a leader in this space, and we'll get to that later on in the presentation. But so far, we're very optimistic with the amount of money that we're seeing move into this space. As a result, there's several regulatory updates that I think are of note. One of the things that has happened in the last year is, as you would expect with any incentive to the private sector of investing, there have certainly been bad actors who have tried to take advantage of the tax breaks in the law without really helping the communities in which they're investing. There's been several prominent New York Times pieces featured around some of these investments that, in our opinion, are actually not good for the communities in which they're investing in, but they are only a few of very, very many good investments that are not getting the kind of press that they deserve. But unfortunately, the ones that are not aligned with the incentive tend to get more of the headlines. And so as a result, you've seen several federal regulatory reform acts introduced, some of which are very positive in that they're trying to increase transparency from the investors going into this. They're putting a higher reporting standard, both financially and in the impact side. They're trying to focus any housing investments on being anti-displacement and non-gentrification. There's also a focus to move into the truly low-end communities that really need this. There are some zones that were designated that are a bit controversial because they may have qualified as low income 5 or 6 years ago, but today they don't really need the same help as others. And we actually think those are very, very positive regulatory conversations to have. On the other end of the spectrum, there is a bill introduced by Representative Tlaib in the federal House to repeal the Opportunity Zone program altogether. We've been told there's an extremely low to no likelihood that that happens, but it does give you a sense of kind of where this sits within the federal kind of regulatory framework. It's everything from how do we improve this to be truly impactful to how do we get rid of the whole thing. So it's become a very, very hot political topic. But I will say on the local side, and this means here in Utah, but also with our kind of other peer states, we are seeing a very positive reception to this. The investments that we're seeing in the state of Utah so far, we view as very impactful and very positive. And as a result, many states have gone out of their way to pass regulatory and incentive packages to try and bring Opportunity Zone investors to their communities. There's actually a bill that is before the state Senate currently, which is House Bill 299, introduced by Representative Mike Winder of West Valley, which is Opportunity Zone enhancements in the state of Utah. And essentially what that would provide is it prioritizes any affordable housing projects taking place within an Opportunity Zone to get existing state housing tax credits. It prioritizes projects that have any sort of clean air or air quality component to them. And for any parking structures that are located near a transit-oriented development, there's a construction tax rebate credit that is being introduced. So we're hopeful that that gets passed here in the final weeks of our session, and we join those 30 states that have already passed regulatory enhancements to try and bring Opportunity Zone investments into the state. But overall, happy to spend time on this when we get to the Q&A, but wanted to certainly cover, this is a very hot topic both at the federal level and the state level, and it's going to be one that we think will continue into 2020. Quickly, just to give you a sense of where we're at in Utah, we're very, very fortunate that some of our local business leaders, in particular, a man named Jim Sorensen, was actually very prominent in getting the Opportunity Zone law passed at the federal level. Jim worked closely with then Senator Hatch to get this thrown into the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And as a result, Utah kind of was very high on the radar from investors across the country from very early on. And so after we selected our 46 Opportunity Zones, the GOED team put out an RFP. We collectively, as I mentioned, between the Association of Counties and Sorensen Impact, responded to that. We collectively called ourselves Opportunity Utah and formed that in 2019. And very quickly, what we noticed was that Utah is extremely unique in that we have two organizations, one of which represents kind of local on-the-ground knowledge in the Association of Counties. We're a membership organization of every single county in the state of Utah. A lot of our leadership are county commissioners, elected officials, truly the folks that are on the ground in these communities, leading from the bottom up, which we think is important. Whereas on the other side, having Sorensen and having Jim's team involved, we had a nationwide team of experts and investment experts kind of representing the other side of the coin. And not very many states have that. Most states maybe have one point person. They could maybe tell you a little bit about the cliff notes of what goes into an opportunity zone investment, but they don't have a team that is really mobilizing around trying to make these investments happen. And so what we saw pretty quickly was that we were recognized by some of our federal peers and federal agencies, including President Trump in April at his Opportunity Zone Summit, recognized Utah as an early leader. We've had several cabinet members out here in the state visiting projects and finding ways to support. So we had Secretary Ben Carson here in July. Just last month, we had Assistant Secretary of Commerce, Dr. John Fleming, who oversees the EDA, out here visiting a lot of our projects and trying to figure out how we get some federal dollars to go in to support them. We've created an inventory of 50 plus projects. We've created prospectuses for every single one of the counties in the state. And what we mean by prospectus is almost like an investor lookbook, if you will, for every one of these counties, saying what the economic development priorities of the county is, what the investable projects might be, what the kind of dollar amount that investors could put into the projects are. And our team is going out and marketing that both to investors here in Utah as well as across the country. We've hosted 2 investor forums, one of which was in Cedar City, the other one being in Moab, where we had investors, including Jim Sorensen and other, very well-known business leaders coming down off the Wasatch Front to attend these events and actually see what investments are being put together. And we're hopeful that we can do a lot more of those into 2020. We were recognized by the National Governors Association and a handful of others. So we're very proud of the work that we've done here in Utah, and just want to note that we've aggregated most of the projects and the prospectuses on our newly formed Opportunity Zones website. It's opportunityzones.utah.gov. We have a big shout out and thank you to the GoEd communications and marketing team for helping us with this. This website is being updated in real time, so I just want to give that caveat. If you go to one of the counties or if you look for a prospectus and it's not there yet, I'd say check back in a week or so, because we're very much in the process of finalizing these with our county level leaders. But we hope that with the momentum we've picked up from last year, the kind of business leader buy-in that we have from not only Jim Sorensen, but folks like Scott Anderson at Zions Bank, we're close partners with IHC, Utah State, a lot of the anchor institutions across our state that have really bought into the process. We can use this website to really make Utah a leader in the opportunity zone space across the country. And so I was going to show a video here to kind of conclude. We made a very impactful video about an investment in Brigham City in what's called the Union Block building using OZ Capital. But I think through the webinar, it just was a little bit too technologically not friendly. It was lagging a lot. The audio wasn't working, but I would highlight that you can see that on our website. You can see it on Forbes, which is who we partnered with to do the video. And the reason I mention it is that as we move into 2020, it's our intention to certainly do a lot more of these, to highlight the communities across the state, to see more impactful case studies, to really be going in and trying to find the types of community investments that otherwise would have a hard time standing out and might have a hard time finding investors. It's really our job to go out there and really be the team trying to play matchmaker between the two. So I would encourage everyone to search that out. I'll make sure to send the link after this webinar, and you can find it on the website as well. But with that, I think we've got about 10 minutes left. I'd love to pause for questions. I don't have the chat box in front of me, but if there are any, I'll let Nan chime in, or if anyone wants to go off mute, I'm happy to take questions.
You bet. Thank you, Patrick. That was great. Lots of information. A question came up: what can the local offices for economic development, primarily maybe the counties and the individual cities, help to move forward with this OZ opportunity?
Yeah. So we've been in touch with most of those offices. If we've missed you, I apologize. We'd love to connect after this call. But I mean, I would say we view the economic development offices really as the main point of contact for our work. Often, that's kind of ground zero in the community for many of the major priorities and goals that are being discussed, whether it's how do we get more affordable housing in our community, or how do we get new jobs and employers, or hey, we don't need any of that, but what we do need is an innovation space or some sort of partnership with an educational institution. All of those things, you may be sitting back thinking, I don't have a list of investments to share with this. I don't know how I fit into it, but really we view opportunity zones as kind of rethinking the way economic development is done. I mean, it's created a really unprecedented conversation between the private sector and the public sector. So I would encourage those offices to kind of get in touch. And where we normally start is saying, hey, what are the economic development priorities for the community, whether it's a city, whether it's a county, whether it's something else, but getting down into it and saying, hey, if it is things like affordable housing, or if it is things like new employers, or if it is something like creating an innovation center, chances are there's some applicability to opportunity zones. And if there's not, the good news is, or if there's folks joining from counties, I should say, that don't have a zone, the good news is we've seen opportunity zones just kind of get used as the lighter fluid to go into the private sector and say, look, you should be thinking about how you get into these new communities because it's a good business decision. And yes, this tax break helps, but even if you don't have it, you should be really thinking about ways to get in and do these investments. And we're seeing the same thing happen with the federal agencies. So EDA, SBA, HUD, the others are really kind of coming to the table and saying, we need to rethink the way we do our programming because we want to support 21st century economic development. And in our opinion, that really requires both the public and the private sector. So I would say, we certainly want to have those conversations, and I would encourage anyone kind of on the call who wants to have that dialogue to certainly get in touch with me, or Nan can put you through to us, but we'd love to sit down and have that chat.
Great, thank you. Anybody have any questions out there? I don't see anything else in the chat box. Or if you do want to ask a question, you can actually unmute yourself. Well, Patrick, you must have answered all of their questions in your presentation. It looks like we don't have anything coming through. One of my questions actually was already answered, but I think it's exciting to note that you're still interested in working with counties that don't have a dedicated OZ. For example, where I live in Wayne County, we don't have one, but it might be really exciting for our county to have higher visibility with investors.
Yes, and that I think is certainly kind of become the second phase of our work is, while our primary focus is still opportunity zones, it's working in these 46 zones that have been established across the state. What we're beginning to see is, using Wayne as an example, is folks from Wayne and others coming and saying, well, hey, we didn't have a zone either because we didn't have an area that qualified, or we ultimately didn't get picked, or whatever the reason is. But we're beginning to kind of think, there's no reason we shouldn't be doing investment prospectuses for every single one of the counties in the state of Utah. And even if you don't have an opportunity zone, you do have things like local incentives, whether they're tax increment or whether they're statewide incentives that GoEd manages. But there are other things that are out there that I think oftentimes the private sector just doesn't know about. And one of the more encouraging things I will say is in our meetings with HUD and the EDA in particular, they have allocated a significant amount of grant dollars to go to communities that are adjacent to opportunity zones. I mean, they heard very loud and clear that there's many places, whether they're cities or counties, that are right next door to one of the hottest zones in the country, and they feel very left out, and I think rightfully so. So what we anticipate doing as we move forward within this is not only kind of continuing our OZ work, but trying to engage those communities that may not have one, and figuring out, how do we have similar conversations, whether it's with the private sector, whether it's with the federal government. But there's ways in which we can support economic development across the state and really open up doors that previously had been shut.
Thank you. We do have a question. Is there anywhere we can see a listing of current projects in OZs across the state?
Yeah, so good question. Not yet, but the idea is, and I'm having trouble navigating back, that you will be able to see, you can kind of see listed right there. It says active projects in one of the tabs that we've got. I will say if you'll click on that now, you're probably not going to find any projects, but we do anticipate that this website will be the kind of inventory of all active projects within the state, and we hope to have at least the beginning list up in the next couple of weeks. So I would check back on this website to look for that.
Thanks. Last call. Any questions out there? Well, Patrick, it looks like we can wrap this up. Thank you so much for a very enlightening presentation. Again, we will have the link to this recorded webinar on GOED's Office of Rural Development web pages, and any other information that Patrick would like to get out to the audience, we will be linking that as well. So with that, thank you again, Patrick, and thanks to all of you for participating. We appreciate it and have a great day.